Before we dive in, where are you reading from right now? Drop your town or country in the comments if this finds you. If this page tugs at you, stick around to the end. I've tucked a little surprise there, and a way you can hear more stories like this. If you like slow burn westerns with heart and hush, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. The auction square smelled of sun, sweat, and dry leather, the familiar bitter perfume of places where fortunes evaporated faster than rain in August. In the small county seat of Thornford, where grain bins creaked empty and prayers seemed to ricochet off the hills, the county auction was a ritual of endings: horses, plows, housewares, the remains of lives put in the wind and called by number. Maeve Hart sat on the edge of the crowd, with her hands stubbornly folded in her lap. Her boots were cracked at the toes, and her skirt had a patch the color of a faded sunrise. Widowhood had been a long winter. The well on her land had gone dry the last year of her husband's life, and the house they'd kept together had kept its silence even louder since the funeral. She'd come to the auction because sometimes people who want to be swallowed by the world go where others are already losing things. Maybe she hoped to lose herself among them, or perhaps she wanted to see how others wore their sorrow. The auctioneer barked like a rooster. Men she'd seen twice in passing walked up and were called by number, bids hopping and falling like a frightened bird. Many of the crowd came for gossip as much as to buy. Thornford had few entertainments that didn't involve elbow room whispers. When Lot 17 was dragged out, a hush crept over the square. The platform groaned under him. He was a mountain in a human shape, wrapped in chains at the wrists, a burlap sack tied tight over his head with a blood-streaked knot. His boots were heavy with dried mud. Even the boys in the crowd shifted closer, because fear and curiosity are the same kind of hunger. Rumors had a way of leaning on one another. Some swore he'd snapped a marshal's neck clean in two. Others insisted he hadn't spoken in years. A favored story described him as a preacher-turned-specter, a man who walked out of the pines and into trouble. No one offered more than a glance. Bids moved like a hesitant river. Then Maeve did something that surprised even her. She lifted her hand and offered $5, the last $5 in her pocket, the coin her grandfather had given her the day she first learned to skin a rabbit. She didn't do it to rescue anyone from their fate. She did it because the shape of him felt like an ache she'd always had and never named, because something in the hollows of her bones recognized the way his shoulders folded inward as if they were always carrying the weight of other people's burdens. They hauled the man to her wagon with the sheepish dignity of people who had been humiliated enough. He was silent when they dumped him over the straw, eyes hidden, chin bared only when the boy who helped Maeve gave him a shove. For a long, slow beat, she thought she'd been foolish. She returned to Thornford after dusk with the man's muffled breathing and a sack of stale bread as her only proof of bravery. When the sack came off, because the boy tripped and the knot loosened, the man said one word: Maeve. Her heart knocked against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through the skin. 20 years ago, when the world had been a different kind of cruel, a stranger had pulled her from the ashes of a wagon train massacre and carried her across the Glint River while bullets stitched the air into threads of fury. She was 12 then, small and raw. He'd leaned over her like a cedar sheltering saplings, lips close to her ear, whispering words she'd not understood at the time but had never wholly lost. He had vanished after the smoke settled. No one had ever known his name. She had kept a photo, folded thin and yellow, a relic in a Bible whose spine had unlearned how to hold itself upright. She'd long believed the driver of that miracle to be a ghost of memory and grief. Now the word from under the sack snagged everything together. Maeve, whispered in a voice softened by iron and time. They called him Silas Crane, though the name hadn't come from him. It came from the auction ledger, scrawled next to Lot 17. He stood like a tree that had been lulled into collapse and refused. And when Maeve handed him a bowl of stew, he accepted it with the slow attentiveness of a man unused to small mercies. He moved like someone learning to live in daylight again, deliberate, mindful, careful not to bruise the floors he crossed. In Thornford, gossip found its prey easily. The rumor mills rolled, not to punish, but to furnish the long hours between whether and where. Folks spoke of Maeve Hart, widow of Caleb Hart, and how she'd paid $5 for a man no one else wanted. Some called her reckless. Some said she'd paid a man to take her life because the price of grief had finally become cheap. Children dared each other to peek into the barn, and the blacksmith shook his head as if it were possible to shake shame off like river silt. Maeve didn't care for the talk. She watched Silas instead. He fixed things he didn't have to. On the third morning, she found him on the rim of the well, the very well that had been dry since Caleb had gone, tightening a rusted bolt, fingers black with grease and old iron. She'd left it to dry up and die with her husband. She had not expected the stubbornness of a stranger to make it sing again. He pulled back old plates, shifted the pump's inner rod with a patience that made the creak of metal sound like a hymn, and then the pump gave a cough, and a thin jet of water answered. It was cold and clear, and tasted like new promises. Silas did not look up when the water came. He simply wiped his hands on his trousers and walked to the barn, as if mending a pump were the most ordinary of obligations. That night, Maeve sat with the Bible and the slim photograph she kept between psalms and prayer, the edges softened by decades of fingers. 7 soot-smeared children huddled in a cluster, and behind them, larger than the rest, stood a man whose face had been scribbled into half-light by a camera that must have been afraid of capturing such a thing. She'd thought the photo had been mailed from a mission or a kindly cousin, but a faint note, almost erased by time, carried Sister Agnes's neat hand. Taken after the raid. For Maeve, keep safe. The face in the background was unmistakable. The man who had carried her across the Glint River was the same one who had fixed her well. At dawn, she slipped into the barn without knocking. Silas sat with a file, working on the edge of a blade, as if the world outside had never existed. She held the photograph out to him. He took it without haste, fingers careful over the fragile paper. His expression, a mixture of memory and weathered sorrow, was like a door opened too slowly. He pressed a finger against the small figure of the girl in the center, the very child she had been, then lifted his gaze to meet hers. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth about men like Silas is that their histories arrive wrapped in halting fragments. Thornford had been fed a dozen stories about him, that he was a preacher who had been appointed to burn souls clean, that he'd snapped a marshal's neck, that he'd vanished because men with badges wanted to see him hung twice over. Rumors fit into each other like old puzzle pieces, forming frightening pictures people were happy to show around. But Silas, once measured against the quiet cadence of the barn and the slow tuck of Maeve's hand into her lap, didn't look like a killer so much as a man who had been forced to choose the lesser of two violences. On an evening when the sky was a bruise of purple, Silas led Maeve to a fence post at the edge of her property. They stood amid the ragged shadows of a winter fence, and he took from his coat a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to her, wordlessly. Inside was a child's sky-blue ribbon, frayed and stained with the downpour of years. She remembered the color, the ribbon a neighbor's little girl had worn during a runaway wagon 3 summers before, the same day Silas had appeared out of nowhere and steadied the slipping wheel with hands large enough to cup a moon. There was also a pocket-worn wooden cross carved by hand, its edges smooth from the same fingers that now held the ribbon. When Silas touched the cross with reverence, Maeve saw without words the life he'd walked in. Faith not shouted from pulpits, but clasped in the night like a lifeline. The story he offered was a layout in motion rather than a speech. When the marshals' badge had carried cruelty instead of law, Silas had decided that some shields were weapons and some men wearing them were predators. The man called Marshal Thane had hung over an immigrant family like a dark promise. Threats, extortion, a menace that family could not withstand. When negotiation failed and innocence hung on the edge of a precipice, Silas had acted. He didn't deny the violence. He simply folded the act into a larger pattern of rescue. To him, the law had been a tool that needed purpose. When purpose turned crooked, he had used other means. That truth sat between them like an unlit coal, dangerous, essential, and prone to flare. Maeve understood, with a clarity that startled her, that Silas's supposed crime was not a wanton lust for blood, but a hand forced by duty. He had chosen to be guilty to prevent further sins from being committed by men in power. To hold his silence had cost him years of exiles and shackles. To let the law drag him through the dirt might have exposed an investigation that the feds still fed on quietly. He had let himself be caught and sold because it was the only way to keep the rest of that truth safe. The next week, Thornford swallowed a new fruit of rumor, a wanted poster. It had traveled through 6 towns and 2 telegraph stations, been folded and unfolded by fingers that trembled with the joy of gossip. The sketch on the paper bore an alias, Elias Crow, and a reward large enough to sweeten cowards. Maeve stared at it and felt the room tilt. The jawline in the drawn portrait matched the one that had bent over her in the ashes. The name was wrong, the face was the same. She folded the poster and took it home like a contraband. That night she found a badge hidden in the back stall, tucked beneath old rags where it had been kept from sight. Deputy U.S. Marshal, the silver read. Underneath someone had written dates, a list of names, scribbled shorthand that hinted at a ledger of corruption, the kind of names that make a house of cards teeter. When she set it on the table, Silas looked up for the first time with eyes that were simply tired of pretending they didn't see everything. She laid out the evidence as one lays out a country one doesn't mean to lose. The badge, the ribbon, the carved cross, the photograph with Sister Agnes's note folded inside. She found, beneath the wood of a floorboard, a notebook, a ledger of names, dates, accounts tied to Marshal Thane. It wasn't just a man on the run. It was proof that Thane's influence spread like rot, that the law was entangled with men who traded bodies and futures for coin. Maeve placed the items on the table like cards on a judge's bench and watched as the story rewound into sense. It was a telegram that finally tilted the balance. Maeve had neither money nor sway, but Thornford had a telegraph office whose operator liked to help when coffee was promised. The message was compact and changed everything. Elias Crow, federal assignment, protective custody approved, stand down. Suddenly the man at auction was not merely a villain, but a pawn in a larger game. Silas had allowed himself to be arrested and hung out to be ridiculed, so that the inquiry could continue without being burned by loose tongues or greedy badgemen. When the lawmen came, 3 of them, dusty and cold-eyed, boots polished hard enough to hold grudges. The town waited for a drama, but Silas was at the pump, tightening a screw as if the world might still turn on small acts of repair. He did not fidget, he did not plead. He lifted his head when they called his name and glanced at Maeve with a look that might have been sorrow or apology or both. Maeve stepped between them like a woman whose grief had finally become courage. She placed the telegram and the badge on the table. One of the lawmen fumbled with his holster when he read the federal line. His jaw unclenched and he returned the notebook with a muttered admission that the matter was not theirs to adjudicate. The gavel of rumor had been knocked out of the courthouse of Thornford. They left with a stiff handshake that might have been respect or might have been relief. The town, which loves nothing so much as narrative, found the drama less satisfying when the man it had condemned walked out on terms rather than in chains. Silas did not walk away. He stayed. He stayed because the life he wanted, a life where he could set down the sharp things inside his chest and sleep, had nowhere to be until he trusted he could trust it. He stayed because Maeve had seen him and named him and given him the small mercy of a human tether. Days folded into each other after that, like the careful turning of pages. Silas mended fences where Caleb had not had the strength. He read the newspaper Maeve could not bring herself to throw away, his thumb following the lines about distant tragedies. He sat on the porch and listened to her speak of mundane things, the way rain used to fall in their valley before the drought, the names of fields she and Caleb had kept, the hole in the wall that never seemed to close. She learned the scar over his knuckle was from a time when he'd held on to a wagon under fire. He learned the way she said her husband's name, and didn't falter with it. On an ordinary evening, when the sky was the color of old tin, Silas set a small wooden box on the table between them. He opened it with hands that trembled and revealed a plain silver band, not carved, not gilt, but honest as hand-stitched work. No one in Thornford had expected that a man who had been sold for $5 would one day offer a ring like it was the most ordinary pledge on earth. He did not make speeches. He did not promise the grand things. He offered the ring as a plain thing that said, "I will stand, I will mend, I will keep watch." Maeve took his hand then, calloused and steady, the same hand that had once wrapped around hers in the wreckage by the Glint River. They did not marry with trumpets. They married with the sunrise, the pump chattering nearby like a small applause. Life was not suddenly golden. There were nights when the wind would come in through the shutter and say, in its small way, that loss was always just beyond the roof. But the well kept running. The farm that had been a place of finality turned instead into a house where meals were not always eaten alone. If this quiet kind of redemption has found you, please drop a comment with where you're reading from. I love to map the people who carry these stories. If the slow bloom of a second chance loosens something in your chest, hit like and subscribe. It helps me know which stories to fold next. Share this with someone who loves a redemption that tastes like coffee at dawn, and ring the bell if you want to be the first to hear the next one. Maeve and Silas lived the ordinary hours that make up an honest life, patching roofs in summer, scaring coyotes in winter, burying small disappointments like stones, and planting seeds anyway. Thornford continued to gossip, but its tone shifted. There was, among the chuckles and sidewise glances, an acknowledgement that people are rarely what they appear when viewed from the porch. Sometimes the town would come by, bringing a pie or a hand of cards. Sometimes they'd come with sharp eyes and softer wills. Maeve never stopped being surprised by the way a life could be remade with nothing but steady hands and the willingness to tell small truths out loud. And for those who worry about the shadows that followed Silas, the things that made him a wanted man in some towns and a saint in others, the world rewarded patience. The federal investigation that had once required a scapegoat continued quietly but thoroughly. Men who had thought their badges granted them sanctuary found their names added to lists, and things that had been traded in the night were returned. Silas kept his eyes low on certain mornings, and sometimes his shoulders shook with a memory he could not shake off. But in the wash of hours, his scars taught townsfolk to be kinder to surfaces that might hide storms. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. And if this one reached you, tell me about it. Where did it coat your ribs? Which part did you tuck into your pocket? Comments help shape what comes next. If you want more like this, quiet rescues, dusty roads, and people who fix the broken with the same hands that once shattered, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Consider sharing this story on your feed or with a friend who loves the slow burn as much as you do. That notification bell, it means you'll be the first to hear when I post the next one. And tomorrow, I've got a story that's a little darker and a little sweeter, waiting beside the kettle. Maeve's life was not rescued by a hero, nor saved by a miracle. It was, instead, rewritten by two people who decided, one tiny act at a time, to replace their hollow places with work and patience and chosen allegiance. She had paid $5 for a man no one wanted. In return, she received a history explained, a field mended, and a hand to take on mornings when the world felt too cold for one. In the end, neither of them had saved the other so much as they'd saved the shape of a life, room in it for mercy, room in it for sorrow, and, slowly, inexorably, room enough for laughter. If that's the kind of story you believe in, press like, leave your town below, and let me know which part you want me to read aloud next. I'll see you on the next chapter.